we'll see how this works. Now, if he determines yesterday to give up the missiles in Turkey, what's going to be the caveat there? And we talked about that yesterday. If we agreed to move, yeah, we're going to wait 6 months to move those missiles so that we can save face. It makes us look like we defeated the Russians in this negotiation, and they go back among their hierarchy and they make it sound like they won because we're taking the missiles out of Turkey. Okay, that's gonna be the deal. So we'll go over the conversation again real quick, like we almost got through, but I want to do it again. So Bobby Kennedy says, in his initial discussion with Dobrynin, and they're in the Attorney General's office, he says, "My brother, my friends, my countrymen, and I cannot and will not permit those missiles to become operational. I promise you that." Dobrynin then responds by saying that I fear our two nations will go to war, and I fear where war will lead us. Robert Kennedy again tries to, strong arm him a little bit. He says, if the missiles do not become operational, if we remove the missiles, then there will be no war. At this moment, the President is accepting the terms of Secretary Khrushchev's letter of Friday night. If the Soviet Union halts construction immediately, removes the missiles, and submits to UN inspection, the United States will pledge to never invade Cuba or aid others in that enterprise. Dobrynin then says, which was expected, I think, if your Jupiter missiles in Turkey were removed also, such an accommodation could be reached. In which Robert Kennedy makes a last stab at trying to get the better deal. He said that's not possible. The United States cannot agree to such terms under threat. Any belief to the contrary was in error. And Dobrynin just says to him point blank, you want war? Is disappointed, starts to reach for his briefcase to leave the meeting. At this point, Bobby Kennedy knows that he's going to have to fold, and he continues by saying, however, while there can be no quid pro quo on this issue, this for that, the United States can offer a private assurance. Now, our Jupiter missiles in Turkey are obsolete and have been scheduled for withdrawal for some time. This withdrawal should take place within, say, 6 months. Of course, any public disclosure of this assurance would negate the deal and produce the most stringent denials from our government. That's where we ended yesterday, I believe, wasn't it? Dobrynin responds by saying, this private assurance represents the word of the highest authority, meaning the President. Robert Kennedy answers yes. And Dobrynin continues by saying, and it can be relayed beyond Comrade Khrushchev's ears to the top circles of my government, in which Robert Kennedy responds, our pledge can be relayed to any government official Secretary Khrushchev sees fit to satisfy, with the caveat that is not to be made public in any way, shape, or form. And what he means by that is if you agree to this, and you pull your missiles and dismantle your missile launching pads, and you blow the whistle before that 6-month period's up, we're not taking those missiles out of Turkey. And you screwed yourself, basically. Okay? And they understood that. So you got to that was pretty big to be able to keep a secret like that for that long. You just can't do that. There's always a leak of some kind. But that was the deal. Now here's the key statement. Robert Kennedy says, and we must have an answer tomorrow at the latest. I cannot stress this point enough. Why? We're airstriking going to war Monday. So they have got to have an answer Sunday at the latest, because Monday they're going in. Okay? So, at that point, a relieved Ambassador Dobrynin excuses himself to give this valuable information back to the Soviet government, and he turns to Bobby Kennedy and he says the following, which I think is somewhat profound. He says, we have heard stories that some of your military men wish for war. You're a good man. Your brother is a good man. I assure you there are other good men. What's he talking about when he says that? I assure you there are other good men on the communist side, on the Soviet side, who believe the same thing, that we can't do this craziness, right? Who are fighting the same people, the military, to stay out of war. He said, let us hope the will of good men is enough to counter the terrible strain of this thing that was put into motion. Now, it becomes pretty tense from that point on until they're going to receive any word of whether this deal was made. Because if the deal's not made, they're assuming that the military of the Soviet Union's in control of government and they're going to war Monday morning. If the deal is made, they will assume that Khrushchev is in control and we have a solution. Well, President Kennedy made all of the cabinet members and ExComm go home that night and spend that night with their families, waiting for word from the Soviets on whether we were going to go to war or not. And Kenneth O'Donnell, when he went to his home to spend the night, he was very concerned, expecting the worst, which would be what? Nuclear war. He was not convinced that Khrushchev was still in power. Nobody in ExComm was, to be honest with you. And it got kind of crazy because that evening, his wife Helen asked him what was going to happen. And this was his quote. Again, you don't have to write this down, but just really listen to what he said. He said, "If the sun comes up tomorrow, it is only because of men of good will. That is all that is between us and the devil." That was his comment to him. If the sun comes up tomorrow, it is only because of men of good will. That is all that is between us and the devil. He's hoping that the sense of good men will make this thing happen. That'll take us then, ends a long day, to Sunday, October 28th, 1962. Sunday, October 28th, 1962. Now, somehow Premier Khrushchev's decision, or maybe that of the military, depending, has to be announced to the world. And Khrushchev was still in power, and he used a media by the name of Radio Moscow to announce to the world that the Soviet Union had agreed to remove the missiles and dismantle the missile bases in Cuba. So the morning of Sunday, October 28, 1962, Premier Khrushchev uses Radio Moscow, which is a media, to announce to the world that the Soviet Union has agreed to remove the missiles and dismantle the missile bases in Cuba. Kids, the whole world knew about this crisis by now, right? I mean, it's very public. And a lot of people are nervous, not just the Soviet Union and the United States, but people in the Western Hemisphere and people in the Communist Hemisphere. They know where this is going to go. And so that when this was announced all across the world that the Soviet Union had agreed to remove the missiles and dismantle the missile bases in Cuba, it was a great relief. And with that announcement by Premier Khrushchev, the Cuban Missile Crisis ends. Officially ends. The crisis is over. Did Premier Khrushchev in his radio announce anything about missiles in Turkey being removed? Absolutely not. But they will be removed within 6 months to make this deal. Now, this is kind of a cool thing. President Kennedy, that morning when they got the news, he met with ExComm and his entire staff. And they were kind of celebrating in what some of their people thought was a victory over the Soviets. Okay, we beat the Soviets. And I think this quote that President Kennedy made to his staff was just so President Kennedy, just so heartfelt. And I just want you to listen to it carefully. This is what he said to his staff when the news came over that Khrushchev was going to remove the missiles and the missile pads, and everybody got together. He said, "You know, it's been a long 2 weeks. I would like to thank you all. I think you all did a great job. But I don't think we should be gloating too much. It was just as much a victory for them as it was for us." What a great quote. What is he saying there? Don't gloat about victory. We're lucky it happened as much as they're lucky it happened. We saved lives here with this decision. And I think when he says it was just as much a victory for them as it was for us, that what he's saying is we got to mend fences here, right? We have got to quit worrying about beating the communists. We've got to start working on it. Now, here's one. He then excused himself to his office where he began to dictate a letter. Now, in those days, this is what, it sounds kind of crazy, but you'll see it. The president or CEOs or whatever had what they called dictaphones. And they were looked like telephones kind of, and you spoke into them and it recorded, and it went into the secretary's office, and what did she do? She typed the letter. So instead of him typing the letter or giving a draft, he would just say, "Dear Mr. and Mrs. Martinez," and then she would type that up and send the letter up. Who was he writing a letter to? Who was he, what? Well, he wouldn't be writing a letter to him.
His wife.
No, that's close. He was his mother and father. He already had a conversation with the wife, but he was dictating a letter to Rudolph Anderson's mother and father. Kenneth O'Donnell went to his office, and this is just kind of ironic, I hope you see the point. He had a paperweight on his desk. You know what a paperweight is, right? Kind of old-fashioned now, but something you put, you know, so your papers don't get knocked all over your desk. But he picked up a paperweight, okay? See that statue of Iwo Jima on the far right side of my desk underneath the cap? That's what that is a paperweight. It's something to, you know, hold your papers on. Well, he picked up his paperweight and he read it, and this is what it said on his paperweight. And the reason I tell you this is I think this is how everybody that was involved in the Cuban Missile Crisis might sum up those 13 days. Here's what it said. I'd like you to write it down. On the paperweight it said this: "O God, thy sea is so great, and my boat is so small." O God, thy sea is so great, and my boat is so small. O God, thy sea is so great, and my boat is so small. Leighton, why do I think that's how you could sum up everybody involved with the Cuban Missile Crisis?
Because it was a big situation.
The problem was huge, right?
If they could drown and like everything could crumble apart.
Easily. I think it means that this, you know, thy sea is so great, this crisis was so great, and each of those people that were involved, Khrushchev, or O'Donnell, or the president, their boat was so small, the chances of them getting through this crisis was just so minimal, really, when you think about everything. And so I think that really just summed things up. Now, I want to give you the results of the Cuban Missile Crisis, why it was so important for the United States, the way the crisis ended. Okay, why was it so important? I mean, we can talk about we didn't lose lives, we didn't have nuclear missiles fired at us, but philosophically, why was this so great for the United States? Anybody want to take a guess? What was our morale like towards communism at this time? Right after, how are we doing in the space race, in the Bay of Pigs, etc.? How are we doing? We're losing the space race, you know, we're losing the space race, we made a horrible decision, you know, the Bay of Pigs turned out disastrous. American morale was horrible about our ability to deal with communism. This decision, and the way the Cuban Missile Crisis came out, gave Americans high morale and uplift that we could compete with communism, that we were finally winning with communism, okay? Think about it. We've had disasters in the space race. We got way behind in that. We had a disaster at the Bay of Pigs trying to overthrow Castro. We've kind of been kicked around a little bit by communism. The results of this Cuban Missile Crisis, and remember, people in America believe that we won this, right? They don't know about the missiles being removed in 6 months. So it gives really a lot, it gives us an uplift in our morale towards communism. Second thing it does is it proves to the American people that, you know, from a boxer's term, we can stand toe-to-toe with the Russians. We can stand toe-to-toe with them. They're not going to bully us. They're not going to beat us up. We can stand toe-to-toe with the Russians and probably would beat them up if we had a chance. So basically what it did is it gave Americans, citizens, the thought that we could stand up toe-to-toe with the Soviet Union. And we mentioned it kind of before. How were citizens feeling about Kennedy's judgment after the Bay of Pigs? Not very good. They questioned it. Well, the results of the Cuban Missile Crisis more than made up for any mistakes he made in the Bay of Pigs. People forgot about the Bay of Pigs and thought about his greatness in the Cuban Missile Crisis. So, in the minds of American citizens, the bold action on the part of President Kennedy during the Cuban Missile Crisis more than made up for the disaster at the Bay of Pigs. How'd that be the president that took you to nuclear war? I mean, I'm telling you, I don't think people even get it. Now, this is a couple things I'm going to say. This is what historians say. President Kennedy's handling of the Cuban Missile Crisis is the greatest example of crisis management in the history of the United States. No other president or leader of any kind had a greater grasp on a crisis than he did. Historians will tell you that President Kennedy's handling of the Cuban Missile Crisis was the greatest example of crisis management in the history of this country. As far as the presidency alone, they will tell you that his wisdom and judgment during this crisis was the best we've ever seen. No other president has ever handled a major crisis better than President Kennedy. I can't think of a bigger, can you think in history of a bigger crisis we've ever had? Well, it was a crisis, it was more of a decision. I think the crisis would have been if we wouldn't have. So I always say that President Truman doesn't get enough credit for saving those lives. He saved about 1 million lives. How many lives did Kennedy and Khrushchev save by holy moly? Yeah, so it's hard to say, but I get what you're saying there, okay? Now, we're going to move on before we get to Layton's passion today. On June 10th of 1963, sadly just 5 months before his tragic assassination, Kennedy gave a speech at American University in Washington, D.C. On June 10th of 1963, tragically, just 5 months before his assassination, President Kennedy gave a speech at American University in Washington, D.C. This speech became known in history as the Peace Speech. As the Peace Speech. Anybody want to guess what the speech was all about? Not necessarily. The results of it, maybe. What was his whole point in this speech called the Peace Speech? With? Very, very good. The speech, he wanted to change the American attitudes towards the Soviet Union. We got to start working together. Jesus, I know we don't get along right now, and we don't always have the same philosophy, but my goodness, do we not have to work together a little bit here? He's trying to work with the Soviets. Who's gained recent criticism for that? Trying to work with the Soviets. President Trump. People are criticizing, Democrats are criticizing like crazy for being somewhat decent to North Korea's leader and to the Soviet Union's leader. Well, Russia. Russia, yeah. Okay? Now, I want to just read a few quotes from this peace speech, and then we're going to watch part of it, okay? Think about what he said here, and again, don't write this down. What's he saying here? He says, what kind of peace do we seek? I'm talking about genuine peace. The kind of peace that makes this life on earth worth living. Not merely peace for our time, but peace for all time. Our problems are man-made, therefore they can be solved by man. So let us not be blind to our differences, but let us also direct attention to our common interests and the means by which those differences can be resolved. And if we cannot end now our differences, at least we can help make the world safe for diversity. What he means by diversity isn't so much races, but by different what? Philosophies and views. But this is the greatest part of it. Now listen to this quote. He says, For in the final analysis, our most basic common link," and he's talking about communism versus non-communism. "For in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's future. And we are all mortal." Don't we all have those things in common? That's his point. We all inhabit this small planet, communist or non-communist. We all breathe the same air, communist or non-communist. We all cherish our children's future, communist or non-communist. And we are all mortal, which means what? We're all going to die someday. Why don't we just get along a little bit? Okay? Now, this is pretty impressive because for the first time in history, a speech given by an American president was on the front page of a Soviet newspaper. First time in American history that a speech by an American president was on the front page of a Soviet newspaper. The newspaper was called the Pravda, which is on your ID sheet. Okay? So the first time and only time in history, a speech by an American president was covered on the front page of a Soviet newspaper, the Pravda. Okay, I'm going to show you quickly this short excerpt of this speech. I'm not going to show you the whole speech, but the part I'm going to show you, I want you to pick up, kind of jot down a couple points he's making, and see if we come up with the same points. You'll hear some of the same things I told you, but I want you to, go ahead, I want you to really see what he's saying in this 5-minute blurb from his speech.
Johnny, turn off the
Yeah,
lights.
please, yeah. Really concentrate on what he's saying. A couple things he's going to emphasize pretty strongly. I want to see if you pick up.
Evil, of course. And even in the Cold War, which brings burdens and dangers to so many countries, including this nation's closest allies, our two countries bear the heaviest burdens. For we are both devoting massive sums of money to weapons that could be better devoted to combat ignorance, poverty, and disease. We are both caught up in a vicious and dangerous cycle, with suspicion on one side breeding suspicion on the other, and new weapons begetting counter weapons. In short, both the United States and its allies